morning, everyone, and thanks for coming to a talk on Zen and the Environmental Crisis. I'm Tom Bowman. We're in Anaheim, California at the Empty Moon Zen Sangha's Anaheim Sangha today. I have a really unusual job. I've been a business owner for more than 30 years. I launched a design agency and a consulting firm, and I've used both of them to help government agencies, museums, aquariums, public utility companies, other corporations, and nonprofits tell their stories. So I get private tutorials in each of my clients' disciplines because I need to know what they do and what they know in order to explain it to everybody else. And things got very interesting for me in about 2003 because I had the rare privilege and an honor, really, to create a new museum in Washington, D.C. for the National Academy of Sciences. Nobody in the design industry gets to create a new museum in Washington, D.C., so for us it was a big deal. And in case you don't know, the NAS was chartered by Abraham Lincoln as a private, nonprofit honor society with the purpose of informing the White House and Congress about scientific issues of national importance. The slogan for the museum that we came up with was "The Science Behind the Headlines." And we opened with the first ever exhibition about the science of climate change in 2004. So it was like, for me, it was like going to graduate school with some of the most eminent and respected climate scientists anywhere in the world. And their attitude back then was that environmental threats are really very serious, and thank goodness we've got plenty of time to figure out what to do about them. Well, just 3 years later, in 2006, I was hired by another group of world-class scientists, this time at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography in La Jolla, California, to create a second exhibition about the science of climate change. And the attitude among the scientists had completely flipped in just 3 years because everything was suddenly accelerating. Polar ice was suddenly melting much faster than anybody had thought it would. And people were burning fossil fuels at a greater rate than anybody had predicted. And all of that sort of leads me to an important personal story. Because there I was on a bluff in a conference room at the Birch Aquarium in La Jolla, overlooking La Jolla Cove in the Pacific Ocean, reviewing science content for the exhibit with the science curator. And I just said casually to her, you know, the folks at the NAS had said to me, pay attention to the oceans, because water can absorb so much heat before the temperature starts to rise that once the oceans begin to warm, we'll be committed to climate change for 500 to 1,000 years. Oh, she said. We're part of Project Argo, which is a bunch of like 2,500 robotic floats all over the world measuring things. She said, we've already measured warming in every ocean basin in the world to a depth of 1,000 meters. Just think for a second how much water that is. That's 3/4 of the Earth's surface, 3,000 feet deep. Just think about how much heat that is. Well, in that moment, the hair on the back of my neck stood up, which is, believe it or not, still possible. And everything I knew about climate change and its horrific impact suddenly hit home in an instant. The dictionary defines an epiphany as a sudden intuitive insight into the reality of something. And I can tell you, no kidding. Because the impact is so sudden and so visceral and so complete that it literally changes your life. And, you know, epiphanies can be joyous, liberating experiences. They can also be the opposite, which in a strange way turns out to be liberating too. And because of the quirks of brain chemistry, when you remember an epiphany experience, it feels almost like living it again, as if for the first time. So there I was, really actually having a hard time breathing, trying to talk to my client, and she says, oh, by the way, my boss wants to meet you now. Do any of you own a business? Well, you do. You guys know how important it is to be cool with your client all the time, right? Well, I walked into her office, I sat down in front of her, and I mean, I was shaking, and she looked at me and she said, is there anything you want to ask me? She was an oceanographer. I said, yeah, how do you cope with knowing what you know? Now we can get down to work. So that epiphany, the sudden, unexpected moment of intense clarity and insight, redirected my life and my work. I knew instantly that I couldn't pretend it hadn't happened. I couldn't put the toothpaste back in the tube. I couldn't unlearn what I had learned. And back then, the only other people who seemed to understand what this all means were scientists. There wasn't anybody in my family or my social circle that I could really talk to about it. And I couldn't even help wondering at times if I was just mistaken, right? Because it was so jarring with the rest of my life. So I began spending a lot more time with scientists and social scientists, social psychologists, with economists, business leaders, policy experts, artists, and others. And we became colleagues. Some of us became friends. We did a whole bunch of projects. I gave a lot of talks at conferences, did a podcast, wrote a book, etc. And along the way, I decided to experiment with trying to decarbonize my little design office. You know, we were a 2,000 square foot building, $3 million business, 12 employees. And on that score, I discovered that it is ridiculously easy to cut carbon emissions out of our daily lives if we want to do it. And if everybody did, I mean, as a national campaign, for example, I would bet we could cut emissions by 25%, maybe 30%, maybe even more in just a few years. My company cut its carbon footprint, we had it measured, by 2/3 in about a year and a half. And we saved money in the process, which is just a way of saying that there's an enormous amount of wasted energy that we pay for and take for granted every single day we're not aware of. So anyway, I won some awards for this, and that got me into circles where I met a whole bunch of other people who were doing amazing things too. I realized I wasn't alone. There are lots of business owners and private citizens and NGOs that are doing extraordinary work that you never hear about behind the scenes. All of which sort of brings us around to Zen, because meditation practice is an invitation into real awareness. Our practice is to experience exactly what's happening in this moment, not what we imagine is going on. Right? I had a drawing teacher in college who used to say, draw what you see, not what you think you know, right? Which was really good advice. And in a way, that's what meditation's like, because it invites us not to react out of habit or belief or cling to what we think we know about the world and, most importantly, about ourselves. So we cultivate clarity and quiet awareness in the moment. And if we keep at it, we develop, among lots of other things, an ability to respond to life with greater freedom and discretion and compassion and skill. So we can fully experience what's actually happening in our own thoughts and emotions and bodies, and in our surroundings too. Perceptions and experience can unfold fully, and we can experience them fully, and then they vanish, and we can let them go when they vanish, as all experiences inevitably do. This practice helps liberate us from the mire of our attachments that, as we chant often, have made us suffer again and again and again. Currently, this is my understanding of what James means when he calls this a practice of presence. And to be honest, if James means something completely different from that, I have no idea what it is. Anyway, the Buddhist Eightfold Path includes some approaches to living our lives in this world, in addition to right view, right intention, right mindfulness, which seem kind of obvious for a meditation practice. There's also right speech, right action, and right livelihood. It's a comprehensive package, and I think the word right helps guide us towards greater compassion and skill as we respond to our experiences and to one another. So, in other words, in the practice of liberation, we are inseparable from our social interactions. The Gata of Atonement says, "My deeds are my closest companions. My deeds are the ground on which I stand." So these threads of developing insight and also more skillful and compassionate actions with others have really powerful implications for how we cope with the environmental crisis. I should also note that Zen gives us another insight too, and it's an assertion about the radical interconnectedness of all beings and all things. And on that particular point, I think Zen teachers and the scientific community are starting to speak the same language about the nature of reality. So, what is this environmental crisis really all about? I'm going to try not to bore you with facts and figures because they tend to come at you like a fire hose. And I think we can boil it all down to a few simple key points. But I will warn you in advance that seeing this for what it really is can be disturbing at the very least. That's been my experience. At times it's been paralyzing, honestly. At times it's been highly motivating. And at times it's even been inspiring to me. And it continues relentlessly to be an invitation for me to practice, both here in the Zendo and outside the rest of my life. So, I said we'll do a few key points. Point number one is that we're stumbling over a bunch of myths, and I would even say fairly dangerous myths. For example, some people think these are problems to address 50 or 75 years from now. Some people think our wealth as Americans will shield us from the worst impacts. Some people say we have no choice but to keep burning fossil fuels because that's how we built up this amazing standard of living, and let's be honest, we don't want to give it up. Some people say protecting the environment will cost too much. They think it's all about sacrifice, and they think that business and the environment are inherently at odds with one another. Some people think responding to climate change will lead to heavy-handed government intrusion into every aspect of our lives. And here's a weird one that most people won't admit to. It's an idea that if we don't have every solution figured out in advance, we shouldn't take action yet. Right? We should wait until we have a whole master plan nailed down. And here's another zinger. These are global problems. My actions are so small that they don't matter. Right? You're nodding your heads. This sounds familiar? Well, I'm here to tell you that none of these things are true. None of them are true. The dangers are already here, and they are much, much worse than a lot of people seem ready to admit, especially politicians and the news media. On the other side of the coin, solutions are much more available and affordable and beneficial than you might think, even though we would really have to implement them on a scale that's never been attempted before. And it turns out that each person's actions really do matter, and I'll explain a little bit why in a few minutes. So all of this suggests, at least to me, that we need to look beyond our personal and political and cultural stories. In other words, beyond what we think we know and what we cling to if we want to really understand what's happening. Point number two, everything is changing a whole lot faster than we think. Interpreting modern history is fraught with peril because every interpretation is partial and therefore inherently partly wrong. But I'd be willing to bet that at least part of the political strife and division that we're kind of getting sick of these days is driven by a deep discomfort that people feel with how quickly our world and our society, our technology, and just about everything else that ever seemed familiar to us is changing. That's a disquieting thing. Does anybody know how many people were alive in the world 2,000 years ago in the year 1 when Jesus was born? It's about 300 million people. That's roughly the population of the United States today. Anybody know when it reached 2 billion for the first time ever in history? It was about 1800. That was like, what, 130 years later. The United States was about 25 years old. The Industrial Revolution had been going for about 50 years. How about 3 billion? Then about 1960, just 30 years later, and that's the year before President Kennedy decided we should try to go to the moon, I was 4 years old. No, yeah, 5. How about, that was 3 billion. How about, well, today? What do you think it is? 7.5, 7.7 billion. And the UN projects that we're headed closer to 10 billion just 30 years from now. It's happening in California too. When I was born in the mid-50s, the population in California was about 10.5 million people. It's almost 40 million, almost 4 times that today. and we're headed towards 60 million in just 30 years. Human beings have never seen anything like this ever before. This is what scientists call exponential population growth. And this kind of growth acts like an accelerator because mainly because everybody in the world wants to live this lavish lifestyle that we Americans live. In India, for example, wealthy suburbs are starting to look a whole lot like Mission Viejo, and Asia is just at the beginning of coming into its own. So population growth plus rapid economic development is changing things really quickly. And here's just a few examples. Cities are expanding into natural ecosystems and carving them up, breaking them apart, and polluting them. And as a result, species are going extinct 1,000 times faster than they normally do. 1,000 times faster than they normally do. Scientists say that as many as a third to a half of species could go extinct as early as 30 years from now. You've probably heard that bees are in trouble. Flowering plants, including all the ones we eat, depend on pollinators. But coral reefs, which are linchpins of ocean ecosystems because they're nurseries for so many species of fish, are struggling too. Even Australia's Great Barrier Reef is declining rapidly and may be dead fairly soon. And forests are dying back, partly due to wildfire, partly due to pests that no longer are killed in the winter freezes because the freezes aren't deep enough. Another example, humans are consuming natural resources faster than nature can replace them. Water has been called the oil of the 21st century because we're draining aquifers faster than nature refills them. And the ancient glaciers that provide water to hundreds of millions of people in South America and Asia are disappearing too. Fertile soil is being eroded, and productive land on the borders of some of the most productive agricultural land in the world is starting to shrink. Meanwhile, the UN says we need to produce 70% more food in the next 30 years to meet everybody's needs and desires. And we've literally changed the chemistry of the air and the sea. This is kind of a shocking thing. When James Hansen, the famous NASA scientist, warned Congress that climate change was real back in the late 1980s, an environmental author named Bill McKibben wrote an interesting little book called The End of Nature. I don't know if any of you have ever seen it. His thesis was that our picture of nature as an untouched, unblemished wilderness no longer applies because we've changed the atmosphere, and the atmosphere touches everything. Therefore, we've touched everything. It's a reminder that we are, in fact, part of nature, and that our mythology about nature being somehow separate and untouched is a myth, and it's out of date. Here's an interesting little side note. Scientists warned Congress about climate change in the late 1980s. More than half of the carbon that we human beings have added to the atmosphere has been added since that day. Well, so given that experts know all this, why is it that we, the consumers and voters and elected leaders of the world, are letting it happen? For one thing, I think this just seems not to make much sense to us, right? It's sort of hard to fathom because it's at odds with our cultural heritage and the stories that we've all grown with. Nobody in human history has ever experienced this, and there have never been enough people alive at any one time to have this kind of impact on the world before. And on behalf of my social psychologist friends, a couple of other points. We humans are biased towards issues that are practical and immediate today. We are biased against paying attention to things that seem abstract and far away. And it's only now that surveys are showing that most Americans are starting to believe that climate change is an imminent thing. We're accustomed to solving problems when things get uncomfortable, even if it's too late. And climate change suggests that there's a certain amount of too lateness that comes with that. We tend to make decisions based on what we think other people will think of us. We take comfort in social agreement, even when the agreements are dangerous and wrong. It was a great social psychology experiment where they put a bunch of people in a room, only one person was the actual subject, the others were shills. And they close the door and they start pumping smoke in underneath the door. And the shills don't react. And invariably, the person who's being examined doesn't react either because the social pressure is so strong against it. This is how we live. And we honestly aren't giving each other much social support for taking any of this stuff very seriously. And I can tell you from personal experience, it takes a lot of courage to go at it alone. And finally, I think it's just plain hard to imagine that a single species is capable of upsetting, global ecosystems, ocean currents, and the climate system all on our own. It just seems to be beyond us. And all of this plays into the hands of the fossil fuel industry's lobbying campaigns. The 5 biggest oil companies that are publicly traded spend $200 million a year on climate lobbying, and we don't even know what the private fossil fuel companies spend. And in a weird way, why wouldn't they? Global subsidies for coal, oil, and natural gas are $5 trillion a year. That's how much humans value having cheap energy. Point number 3, I've talked a lot about climate change. Well, climate change trumps everything else by a mile. I haven't said much about air pollution or water pollution or plastics or oil spills or dead zones or nuclear waste. They're all important, but climate change is the only environmental threat that actually shakes the foundations of our civilization and the natural ecosystems that we depend on for water, food, and livable homes. If you look at geological history, at global averages of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and temperature over eons, there are warm periods and there are ice ages, and warm periods and ice ages. And coming out of the last ice age, as things got warm, there's this curious little flat spot where both things leveled off in an uncharacteristic way. That little flat spot is where the entire history of human civilization has occurred. In other words, and this goes back at least 650,000 years, probably a million years or more. In other words, an unusually stable climate allowed people to plant crops and settle down and build cities. It allowed our population to grow and our technology to develop and our standard of living to rise. Well, here's the sad news. We have already pulled the rug out from under all of that stability. Mostly in the last 75 years, we've increased carbon dioxide, which is a heat-trapping gas, in our atmosphere by 33%. That's an enormous thing, and atmospheric carbon hasn't been that high in any time in human history before. So, what does it mean? For one thing, changing the climate amplifies every other environmental threat that's going on, because it pushes natural systems up to and beyond their limits to respond. But it also has other consequences too. It gets hotter, for example, and that means productivity declines, people suffer, and people die. Heat waves kill people, and they cause massive migrations. The Syrian refugee crisis in Europe is driven, in part at least, by higher temperatures that reduced rainfall, which increased water scarcity and food insecurity for people who are already living in very difficult conditions. This is one of the ways that climate change impacts actually work. They amplify social tensions like poverty and tyranny and religious conflict that already existed. And this stuff has far-reaching consequences. Right now, Europe is struggling to cope with about 1 million Syrian climate refugees, or Syrian refugees, however you define it. Well, the UN projects that in 30 years' time, there will be as many as 200 or 250 million environmental refugees on the move. Just think about what that means for society. And a recent story in the New York Times says that the caravans of Central American asylum seekers in Mexico are driven, at least in part, by rising temperatures that are making agriculture in places like Guatemala all but impossible. So we're at the beginning. And it's not just about heat waves, because weather is becoming more violent, generally speaking. Drier places are getting drier, Wetter places are getting wetter, and it's all happening with a lot more ferocity. We've already seen more intense storms, more downpours, instead of gentle rains, more hurricanes. We now have the term bomb cyclone in our weather forecast. Never had that before. More flooding, more wildfires, more drought. And all of this means more people have to evacuate their homes, more businesses are lost, damages go into the billions of dollars, there are more injuries, there's more disease, and there's more loss of life. Sea levels are rising too. Scientists used to talk about 2 to 3 feet of sea level rise by the end of this century. That seems far away and beyond most of our lifetimes, so it's easy to ignore. They're now talking about 7 feet or 8 feet or maybe even 12 feet of sea level rise by 2100. That means that major cities in the US and around the world will have to create defenses or move inland or be abandoned altogether. Low-income farmers in floodplains like Bangladesh and the Mississippi Delta will simply have to move. And low-lying island nations are already being flooded during storms, and some of them, like the Maldives and the Marshall Islands, are going to disappear altogether in the next few decades. This means high costs, economic disruption, social upheaval, more coastal pollution, and more migrations. And finally, natural ecosystems can't adapt fast enough to survive either. I said that 30 to 50% of species are in danger of dying out in the coming decades. Scientists say we have entered the planet's 6th mass extinction event. If you don't know, a mass extinction event is when 75 to 90% of species vanish forever. And historically, it takes millions of years for other species to repopulate the planet and replace them. So we are staring at a century of vanishing life and upheaval. That's not the happy part of the story. Point number 4, the sooner we act, the better off we're going to be. Scientists aren't saying we have time, thank goodness we have time to figure this out anymore. They're saying it's really time to get busy. So can we avoid all the nasty impacts? The answer, unfortunately, is no. It's too late for that. Some experts even think that the 2-degree limit that the world's nations agreed to in the Paris Climate Accord might be out of reach. Maybe it is. Maybe it isn't. Can we minimize the impacts? Absolutely, you bet we can. And the faster we move, the more benefits like cleaner air and better health and more stable communities we get to enjoy. Can we do it cost effectively? The economists say emphatically, yes. It's expensive, but it's a really good investment. I mean, not only compared to the alternative, which is to pay for unending damages, but energy is called the mother of all markets. And clean energy is called the biggest economic opportunity ever in the world. Do we have to solve every problem before we get started? Absolutely not. We need to get moving with some skill, and we need to keep at it. I know some really smart scientists who like to call climate change a wicked problem, which means that it's so complicated that it defies solutions. All we can do is try to manage it as best we can. Sound inspiring? In the words of an old theology professor of mine, it's also stupid and wrong, because that's really not how social change works. We never come up with a master plan and then execute it. In reality, innovations happen all over the place, all the time. And each innovation creates new opportunities and new choices. And eventually, some of them are big, some of them are small, but eventually, over time, they coalesce, and something new seems to emerge out of this, almost out of nowhere. Right? So complexity, for all its problems, can also be an asset. Check out these points. Clean energy gives us better health immediately. This has been tested and proven. When we don't burn fossil fuels, which are the cause of climate change, we get less smog, and people's health improves right away. Renewables are already cheaper than coal, and that wasn't true just a few years ago. And the prices continue to drop. The World Bank won't even fund new coal-fired power plants anymore. And believe it or not, China scrapped plans for over 100 coal-fired power plants in order to build renewables instead. They haven't torn down any coal-fired power plants that are running now, but they are switching, they're developing renewables faster than anybody else. Markets always surprise the experts. Economists used to say that coal-fired power plants were locked in for another 30 or 40 years because companies had to amortize these enormous investments they made in building them. Well then, out of the blue, fracking, for all its problems, dropped the price of natural gas. And almost overnight, within 2 or 3 years, almost all coal-fired power plants in the United States switched to natural gas. As one inventor likes to say, the goal of invention is to make something that's better for us so attractive that people are happy to abandon the things that are not helpful to us. Right? Nobody saw that market shifted from coal to gas coming. And they never can, because economic models simply can't accommodate or can't account for innovation. So they tend to be more pessimistic than they need to be. And we can all slash emissions right now if we want to. As I said, energy efficiency pays and opportunities are incredibly abundant. California, which drives a lot of energy efficiency standards, has the most ambitious climate laws in the country. And we also have a lot of influence because California, on its own, has the 5th largest economy in the world. 3 other states have already joined us in requiring 100% renewable electricity by 2050, or at least carbon neutral electricity by 2050. That's Washington, Hawaii, and New Mexico. Nevada and New York are looking at it. Pennsylvania is considering a cap and trade system. And cities are taking action too. Something like 160 US cities already have laws on their books for 100% carbon neutral energy in the coming decades. And over 9,000 cities around the world have signed a climate compact. And so solutions to this stuff aren't partisan at all. Did you know that Iowa gets a third of its electricity from wind? I was on a radio show with a conservative host who wanted to beat me up about how renewables are completely impractical. And I mentioned that Iowa gets a third of its electricity from wind, and he was speechless for a moment before he said, "Really?" Georgetown, Texas, which is a city in the heart of oil company, gets 100% of its electricity from renewable sources because its Republican mayor figured out that it was a lot cheaper that way. Greensburg, Kansas is recognized around the world as a model green city. When I asked some of the people who worked on that project why they adopted our liberal West Coast values, they said, "Hey, we're farmers. Taking care of the land isn't liberal for us. It's just what we do." There's an enormous, I think, repository of desire and goodwill in our society waiting to see more action happen. Gasoline and diesel cars are becoming obsolete pretty quickly. Germany and Britain won't allow car companies to sell them after the year 2030, and that's forcing every automaker in the world to start moving toward electric and fuel cell vehicles. And Bloomberg just reported last week that the purchase price of an electric car will probably be lower than the purchase price for a gasoline or diesel car in just 3 years' time. And since they cost almost nothing to maintain, kind of going to be kind of a no-brainer. And kudos for innovations that are happening. And I include in this Energy Star, which is a voluntary federal program that rewards companies that build appliances and anything else that's more energy efficient. Did you know that an Energy Star refrigerator today is so much more energy efficient than an Energy Star refrigerator was 10 years ago that Edison will give you a rebate if you'll go out and buy one? Tesla single-handedly transformed glorified golf carts into the #1 selling luxury cars in America. And Solar City and Sunrun and the other solar companies have made solar power affordable for almost everyone. My point here is that innovation never stops. And as innovations take hold, they create new opportunities for all of us. All of which sort of brings us back in a roundabout way to Zen. I introduced myself with my climate epiphany, which was a shocking experience that put me on an emotional roller coaster for a long time. I worked for a while with a climate scientist who likes to say, "I'm optimistic Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. I'm pessimistic Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays. And Sundays are up for grabs." But I think it runs a lot deeper than that. I've known since 2006 that I really had no choice but to let my thoughts and emotions arise and blossom and then vanish again and again and again, no matter how disturbing and discouraging or inspiring they might be. And they continue to be both. But that's just how thoughts and emotions work. That's what they do for a living. So I set my intention to do exactly that. And I wondered if this is really too much to ask of anyone else, and if it's even necessary to, because facing all this suffering to be, if you really let it sink in, and our accidental, almost everyday complicity in it is not an easy thing to face and to live with. I think a strong meditation practice is a great tool for helping cope with it. Buddhism reminds us that old age, sickness, and death are inevitable too. Right? The practice doesn't offer salvation from any of these phenomena. It offers freedom from the suffering that we derive from these phenomena. We live our lives, or our practice, here in the meditation hall and through our interactions with other people. I think that breaking the ice and talking about environmental issues with our friends, family, co-workers, and colleagues might help us move the needle toward productive action, because it would start to build the social support that everybody needs. And it might encourage more of us to take practical actions that can actually, as consumers and voters, that can do some good. There's a line that we chant sometimes that says, "Turn around the light to shine within, and then just return." I think this is both advice for meditation practice and for making some practical decisions. At one point, I think it was around 2007, I decided to turn the light inward in a really pragmatic way. I made a list of my resources, my skills, my talents, my interests, my social and professional networks, my social position. These are my tools. They're resources for finding ways to contribute to positive change, and they're different from each of the tools that each one of you have. I think anyone who wants to can do exactly the same thing, because in reality, it's the diversity of our interests and our talents and our skills and social networks of influence that are going to make a difference one way or another. And I'd like to close my opening remarks with one last image. I am particularly fond of a couple of books written by a guy named Lawrence Gonzalez. He writes about surviving or not surviving extreme circumstances. They're called everyday survival, as in, why do some people stand on the beach and watch a tsunami roll in and kill them? Why do some people walk past the police barricades to get closer to Mount St. Helens right before it explodes? The other book is called Deep Survival, as in, why do some people survive wilderness accidents when other people don't? A plane crash, an avalanche, any of those kinds of things. He observes that when things look normal, like they do most of the time now, we tend to think everything actually is normal, even if we know better. And this kind of cognitive dissonance is really hard to deal with, and it can lead to trouble. So we stand on the beach, because the beach is supposed to be a friendly place. But accidents and disasters do happen, and people really do find themselves in dire circumstances sometimes. And when things look bleak, some people spiral into despair. They usually don't do much to help themselves, and according to his books, they usually perish. Those who survive, on the other hand, don't get wrapped up in themselves. They often say they had someone to live for, and they usually mean somebody specific, a spouse, a child, a parent, anyone who they didn't want to let down. And they see reality of their circumstances for what it is. They don't get lost in imagining whether they're going to live or die. They admit, at least implicitly, that they can't possibly know. Even so, in each moment, they take a small constructive step. They do what Gonzalez calls the next right thing. As events unfold, they do the next right thing again, and then they do it again. In other words, they don't react blindly, and they don't cling to false hopes or false impressions of who they think they're supposed to be. They respond with some clarity and some level of skill to what's actually in front of them, and if things go well, they have a happy ending. I am real fond of this idea, partly because I've lived it and had a happy ending, but also because every species expands until it starts to run out of resources, and then it dies back. And the dying back is painful. It involves famine, and violence, unrest, sickness, all kinds of suffering. We humans are the first species to be able to see a crash like this coming. I really don't know. We have the tools to solve it. I really don't know whether we will or whether we won't. I don't think anybody can predict the future that way. But I do know one thing, that if we want to, each of us has the capacity to see the reality of our circumstances for what it is, and we can find creative ways to do the next right thing.
So good.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Well, there's a lot there to talk about.
A lot there. We have 15 minutes. I would encourage anybody who wishes to, the bathrooms are in the back, through the kitchen.
You can go there and throw up because of what